The minus part is because I don't know that we had that other breakout that was truly sort of transformative and like a guy who entered the top 100 conversation that you might hope out of every season happens. That didn't really occur, but those 6 guys were so good that you still, I think, have to go with it.
Holy cow! Welcome to another broadcast of Bricks Behind the Ivy.
Hey, Cub fans, welcome to another episode of Bricks Behind the Ivy. I am always your hostess, the mostest, Jeff Ragauskis Ragauskis, and today, joining me, I have a special guest, and another person from Northside Bound to join the pod, Mr. Bryan Smith. Bryan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So,
fan over here, and excited to talk Cubs minor league baseball.
Yeah, absolutely. So, at the recording of this episode, the episode has not technically released yet, but we'll have just released our end-of-the-year grades for the Major League Club. And I felt that it only made sense since there's a lot of, and we'll put it nicely, disappointment around the Major League team and the optimism that came from the postseason presser and Mr. Ricketts' letter to the fan base seems to be centered around the farm system. Maybe we should get someone who, looks at the farm system all year round to bring letter grades for the farm system to see if there is a similar optimism from folks who watch more of the minor league team as sold to us by Jed and Tom as we head into the off season. So I appreciate you coming on and kind of being our armchair expert today on the Cubs' robust and improving farm system.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, you make a good point that it is a big part of the sales pitch of this regime and the ownership right now, and so I think I think it makes sense for Cubs fans to sort of be skeptical until they see it, but at the same time, part of being a sports fan is hope, and the great thing, what I love about the minor leagues is that it sells hope on like the most sort of pure scale that you can get. It's that's all it is for me and I think the guys that follow the minors like I do is just it's dreaming on what these guys could become and and not bringing cynicism to the table as much as the major league team allows us to do.
And I think that's something here at Bricks Behind the Ivy we try to work really hard on is try to, be as even keel on the perspective, not be too overreactionary, not be the hot takes. There's plenty of that content if you want it out there on this team. Yeah. You can go find it. I know where to find it. I find it from time to time because I need it. But that's not what we're here for. We're here to kind of bring some information and, try to help you along the path as a Cub fan to kind of generate your own opinion and how you think things are going or how you want to feel, not necessarily dictating how you should feel. But a tradition of Bricks Behind the Ivy for every time a guest comes on for the first time is kind of talk about their baseball or their Cubs story. Assuming that you're being from the Chicago area, we were chatting a little bit beforehand, assuming it's a Cubs story. But how did you get into baseball and what's your Cubs story?
Yeah, the funny thing about my Cubs story is that my dad is a White Sox fan more than he is a Cubs fan, kind of one of those that roots for both. But I grew up in the 90s, so it was just basketball was the only obsession for most of the 90s. I was just a Michael Jordan kid through and through. And then, the Kerry Wood game happened, and that sort of opened my eyes to baseball being this incredible thing. And that game sort of turned on the lights for me. And I think, became a Cubs fan through that game. And then, honestly, that sort of led to my interest in the minor leagues too, because, so much of what Cubs fans were doing in May 98 is trying to figure out, like, where did this kid come from? And how is he this good already? And I was curious about that too. And so, my dad and I back then kind of went through the wormhole of learning about the minor leagues together and getting into it that way. So yeah, it all dates back to that fateful afternoon in May.
So we've had a nice journey this year. We've had Brendan King and Alex Cohen on the pod to talk about different players and the South Bend Cubs being, very close to Chicago. And Alex Cohen has been so gracious with his time, and him kind of cool getting his opportunity later in the year on Marquee to call some games, as Boog was called for some of his national duties. But we've been able to kind of touch in on some of the more exciting players. The Cubs currently have, several players in that top 100 sphere. There's some debate on whether or not any of those individuals are the type of player you kind of really can build a team around, as much as they're just very, very good players, much like how their roster is currently constructed. But let's talk about the grading of the Cubs minor league system. So when we graded the major league team, we looked at starting pitching, relief pitching, offense, defense, and overall. And it's probably a harder thing to say unilaterally for the minor league teams, but I guess we can kind of start with starting pitching or pitching in general from the minor leagues. Cade Horton looked really good early on. There's a clear dip later in the year that also ended with an injury. There's a lot of rotation depth that was used and supplemented to the major league squad that I would still potentially include in that minor league group, like Ben Brown, who got a really nice long cup of coffee before some injury issues this year, and a bunch of other different bullpen pieces that I've seen some time. How would you grade the pitching system overall in the minors for the Cubs this year?
Yeah, I mean, so I really want to get scientific with our grading here, so I got to ask a clerical question up front. My question is, for the purpose of our grading, do we want to think about Pete Crow Armstrong, Ben Brown, and Porter Hodge specifically? If I say those three, do we want to give credit to what they did in the major leagues as stemming from the minor league system, or do we just want to think about what happened in the minor leagues? Because especially for the pitching side of it, I think it's important to sort of make that distinction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we should probably assume if they've been graduated off of a top prospect list based on the number of appearances, they should not be included in a grade for the minor league system. So immediately.
So I'll say up front, just hitting on those guys real quick, I thought what Ben Brown did to stabilize the Cubs pitching staff in May into June, when things were falling apart, and then Ben Brown hits his stride into June, was so important. And then what Porter Hodge did alongside, Tyson Miller and Jorge Lopez to stabilize the bullpen there July into August were two of the most important things on the major league side. So I thought it was so, I guess before we get into that minor league side, I think it's worth reflecting back to those specific moments in time where it seemed like the Cubs were sort of falling apart. Yes. And that it was these two minor league guys that I think really did have this stabilizing effect on the whole pitching staff was such a takeaway for me for those guys specifically.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, going into 2024, there was some commentary, I remember, I think by either Jed or Carter in spring training when addressing specifically pitching, there were some questions from Boog and JD around the lines of, do you think you have enough pitching? And they had really highlighted, we have a lot of depth in our minors league system. We had a lot of depth. And unfortunately, I feel like their depth was tested immediately, which was too early, right? Way more than they expected. Which, you could argue, maybe they should anticipate for that just because of how fragile pitching is. But on the other hand, they were correct in a lot of capacity of, Ben Brown did contribute, and guys that we thought would contributed in a significant manner and really kept things afloat. But they really ran through those guys pretty quickly, unfortunately, at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I think you could say 6 of their 7 top bullpen plans were injured or completely ineffective by May 10th. And, that's a bizarre way to start a season. But so I'm going to set aside Ben and Porter and I'm going to answer your original question. I think if you're just grading the minor league prospects currently in the Cubs system on pitching this year, I think I would go C-.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I weight the top of the system a lot, and I think there's no way to sugarcoat that Cade Horton's season was just a disappointment. I think there were legitimate dreams that Cade would come into the majors by June and, be sort of stabilize the rotation in the way that Ben and Porter did in their roles. And the fact that didn't happen, the fact that, before he got injured, he didn't look that great when he got to Iowa. He didn't look like the guy who pitched down the stretch in Tennessee so dominantly last year. And then the injury that takes him out for the rest of the season. It doesn't impact, I think, his grade moving forward so much. But if we're reflecting back on 2024, I think like that's a big chink in the armor that this guy who was legitimately a top 25 prospect, like, didn't take a step forward at all. In truth, probably took a small step backward.
Yeah, I think, starting the year, a lot of fans are likely penciling him in as 2025 top-tier rotation arm. And this year, I think there was a point, especially during the great Hector Neris experience, where I thought, looking at the back end of 2023 for him, like short burst Cade Horton, the Craig Counsell Express of getting these guys exposed out of the bullpen, and similar to Porter Hodge, and if his stuff plays and not having to use all those pitches, like have him be as back in the bullpen, high leverage, if it worked out. I really saw that as an option, but then I continued to watch the AAA numbers and it was like the strikeouts aren't quite there, the velocity's down, like something looks off, and obviously it led into an injury, so it makes you wonder how long he was struggling with the injury prior to that, or if there was something else going on that led to the injury. But yeah, that was a pretty big disappointment, I think from a Cubs perspective. I think it was kind of like written in the stars going in this season that we'd at least see him, and not seeing him feels, it's a delay. And Shahada Sharma and Patrick Mooney were talking about that, not Cade Horton specifically, but what these delays can do and how it changes the calculus significantly in regards to Justin Steele. He had Tommy John, and people talk about how he's been this great stabilizing force for the Cubs rotation, but they still have 3 years of control on him, and when he reaches the free agent market, he'll be 32. There's not really this incentive around making him this like cost-controlled contract offer because he's a little bit older. There's less of a concern of really the cost control and a little bit more of a, let's see how this works out. He's already at Tommy John at 32. Sure. If like this falls apart, like we can let him walk instead of locking him in. And it's weird when you start thinking about those timelines of Cade Horton being, an older arm in college, and this being a quasi not lost season, but no MLB experience. And I think we're heading into his age 25 season, 24 season next year. And it changes the math significantly.
It does, yeah. I mean, I think the good news is that there's still a bunch of reason for optimism. We're still talking about a guy who, has an absolute major league out-breaking pitch in his slider, whose fastball, I think, I think that was the pitch that was most affected prior to his injury. That was just down a little bit, but it has the kind of movement the Cubs like. I think they're happy with that. His curveball and changeup both took steps forward at the end of 2023 and showed themselves fine this year. I think there's every reason to think that he's a big league starter still, but we're kind of left saying the same thing we were a year ago. Like, I hope he's up by summer, and then I hope he's a lock in the rotation the next season. And, that's just a repeat. And it's up to him to sort of bust through that door now and sort of change the narrative and push it back to like, no, I'm a top 10 prospect in this sport. And, I hope he does it. And I have some belief that he will, because he's a phenomenal athlete and one of those like competitive type of people that, he's not going to sit back on this and just rest on his laurels. He's going to go get it.
So with C- being the grade, that's, teetering to slightly below average. Obviously, with the top prospects, I'm going to expect a higher grade for offense. But before we move on to offense, is there another pitcher that you're going to put on the radar for Cub fans as someone that's going to potentially move the needle on that grade in the next year or so? Is it the bird cell at AAA? Is there a guy that you think isn't being talked about enough that could really change the grade of the minor league system for pitching?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I think the reason that I went C minus, I honestly, like, when I think about these grades in the minor leagues, it's almost two pronged. You think, A, how did the top prospects do? Because that's sort of the most important. That's what moves the needle in the major leagues. And then
Sure.
B, did you have those breakouts that you want to see? And it felt like for a long time this season, like, shoot, the Cubs aren't having those pitching breakouts that I was really hoping we would see this year. And then you mentioned the name, like Brandon Birdsell's second half sort of changed that a little bit for me. And that honestly probably takes the grade from like a D to a C minus for me, because he, I think, has emerged as a top 10 prospect, a guy who absolutely could contribute in like spot start form in 2025. And then I think like what role he'll take on with the Cubs will be an interesting thing that will be figured out next season. And so I thought that was a really positive event from this year. And then going into next year, looking at possible breakout guys, I think the Tennessee rotation next year, AA, is going to have, it's going to be top to bottom with guys that like have that potential to break out. You're going to have Jackson Wiggins, who was the second round pick in 2023, who had a up and down year in high A, but has a hell of an arm. I really like this guy named Arian Rodriguez, who was a day 3 pick 2 years ago, who's taken some time, but just looks like the kind of pitcher. Kind of looks like, remember Luis Gil on the Yankees, who just came up and shoved against the Cubs that game? He sort of looks like him a little bit, which is fun. You have Drew Gray, who's an arm the Cubs gave 7 figures to, who had a really nice end of the season. That rotation next year, if Cubs fans want to sort of spend the first 6 weeks of next season like looking for a reason to be excited in the minor leagues, I would recommend like watching the starting pitchers from Tennessee, because that's going to be where it'll happen.
I'll be definitely watching that because I do remember a lot of those names from the South Bend roster. And towards the end of the year, we tried to kind of do this daily video series wrapping up the scores across the entire Cubs system to keep people informed of, maybe some guys are popping up and checking in on. But Jackson Wiggins is one that definitely stuck out as one that was really doing, some interesting things at times at South Bend. And yeah, it'll also be interesting to see if like the offense continues to be, a little bit lower in Double A, because I do recall that being an issue in evaluating some of the Cubs' top prospects there, as the average, the league average OPS there was down significantly, which really changed the evaluation of some of the prospects we were looking at, and especially was catching that in Greg's Bash metric on how they were doing in comparison, to other people in that group. So that
you'd see a guy with a 750 OPS, and it would be like he's the league's third best hitter, and you'd be like, wait, what?
Exactly. So I think it's a perfect transition to the offense, and I think this is probably where the Cubs system is the strongest. But even on that case, how would you grade the offense? Even like with the top prospects, they're probably carrying a lot of the weight in the grade, but are there other factors that are going to really push that grade up that we're missing?
I think you've nailed it. I think the top prospects sort of answered the call this year and did what they were supposed to do and had good seasons. And so I'm going to go A minus, with the A part of that grade being a reflection of those top 7 or top 6, I would say, hitters in the system, like just getting their business done and taking the next step forward and being in the place right now that we hoped they would be a year ago, almost across the board. I mean, we could talk about each of them individually, but Matt Shaw, Owen Casey, Moises Ballesteros, James Triantos, Kevin Alcantara, and Cam Smith, those 6 guys all had really positive 2024s that you can be really happy about. And that is like, that is a reason that the hitting part of the system did well. Like the minus part is because I don't know that we had that other breakout that was truly sort of transformative and like a guy who entered the top 100 conversation that you might hope out of every season happens. That didn't really occur, but those 6 guys were so good that you still, I think, have to go with an A.
Yeah, I think that's those are probably the household names for the diehards. Especially I think towards different parts of the years. Ballesteros was getting some calls from fans as they were trying to kind of climb their way back in the division of like, just call him up, like let's see what he can do. And obviously, you know, like there's a longer term plan in play, and that might not necessarily be the smartest, you know, front office decision as much as it's the fan-hearted, simple decision of like, let's inject this young bat into play. But yeah, I think the one thing that's very interesting, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, and this is, I feel like a complete like juxtaposition of the prior question, but there's a lot of outfield prospects. There's a lot of infield prospects, and the Cubs really have some solidified spots at the major league roster. And you know, like I always think of the 2016 team when people are like, "Where are these guys going to play?" Like that was the worry with Kyle Schwarber in 2016 and entering the season,
Sure.
of him and Jorge Soler, and then we had a collision in center field that kind of solved that problem the way that we didn't want it to be solved. But you know, if you were looking at the group, are there people that you would assume, like from your perspective, that are untouchable in trades, or are these individuals that you feel that a group of them, or maybe someone in the major league roster, will be traded in order to supplement the major league squad?
Yeah, so I'd say like just philosophically, I'm definitely of the belief that like there should be no such thing as an untouchable. That being said, if we're being realistic about the way that baseball works in the 2020s, top 10 prospects in the sport just don't really get traded. I mean, I think if you look at it, you know, there have been 2 in the last 6 years, I want to say, that have been traded, James Wood and I don't know that I can. CJ Abrams maybe was still a prospect, but generally speaking, that commodity has become so valued in baseball that it doesn't get traded. So Matt Shaw is sort of, by definition, but of modern baseball, sort of untouchable, because it's very unlikely that there is a player that would become available on the trade market that would sort of demand a top 10 prospect in the sport. And I do think what Matt Shaw did in 2024 is like worthy of being sort of that, I don't know, 7 to 12 ranked prospect in baseball.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I think he's right there. And so he's the guy that we probably have to start to think about what role he would take in the majors next year. The other guys, everything needs to work in the context of getting the major league team back into the playoffs. And so if that means trading them, if that means asking them to break out next year and absolutely knock the door down to create a role for themselves, like whatever it may be, they have to sort of live in service of the organization, where Matt, I think the organization might have to sort of figure out something for him. He's the one that's different from the rest to me.
So on the offensive side, similar to the question on the pitching side, you know, I think there's some guys, you know, kind of outside of, you know, obviously the top of the Cubs organization that are interesting. One that really caught my attention this year in a positive developments way is Christian Hernandez. There was obviously a lot of pomp and circumstance when he was signed in his IFA class, and some really just aggressive comps of like A-Rod and things, if I remember correctly, which is just an alarming pedigree for a 17-year-old or 16-year-old, I think, at the time to have to fill. And he's still extremely young. He's like, there's still time to grow, but there seemed to be a step forward this year, finally. Maybe not necessarily where I wanted to see in the power, but, you know, the batting average and the discipline and the contact rate seemed to, you know, take a nice leap. And it was also nice to see, you know, very interestingly, Ed Howard get a cup of coffee in Iowa. Just like the the lack of true like Chicago athletes to actually play in for a Chicago team. There's a very
Yeah.
like small group of individuals that have accomplished that. Are there any players, outside of the top that you think took a very major step and are worth kind of like earmarking for next year?
Yeah, my favorite player to sort of follow this season was an outfielder in Myrtle Beach named Alfonso Rosario, who was
Okay.
a mid round pick for the Cubs in 2023. Kind of a unique selection. He'd spent, I want to say, I don't know that I have this for sure, but I think that he spent like a gap year essentially post high school at like a prep academy,
Okay.
and so he was drafted older than most high schoolers, but he was sort of essentially a high school pick, and he was awesome last year for a teenager in Myrtle Beach. Really hard place to hit. He lasted on the roster the whole year without ever really going into a deep slump. Played center field. Was kind of like he was really close to 2020
Oh wow.
on both sides. I think he fell maybe just short in home runs and just got over in steals, but he's kind of what's a good comp for his build? He's almost like a young Moises Alou type build, where it's not like a super duper athlete, but he does enough athletically, both sort of he's strong enough and quick enough that you're happy with it in both directions. Struck out a bunch, struck out 150 times or something.
Oh wow.
So like his weakness is sitting right there in front of you. But there's not a lot of 19-year-olds that can hit for the power he did this year and still show the athleticism to steal a bunch. So he's the one that if they can solve that one big glaring issue, he'll be a lot of fun.
So I know beforehand you said you were still kind of trying to rein in what it is. Best storyline in the minor league system this year. Now that we've been talking for a bit, is there one that really is sticking out, or are there a few that are still kind of reaching the top tier that you can't pick from?
I think the best single story that happened this year in the Cubs was the Cam Smith run streak. I think that I that was just so wild and historic in some ways, but also what that does to set a first round pick's confidence into next season, like has the chance to be really meaningful for the organization. Because like when you're looking at Cam Smith, you're talking about a guy who could be a third baseman with 25 plus home run power. I mean, it'd be hard to say the type of player that would fit this Cub major league roster like better than, especially if we're talking about like a year or two from now, than that type of player, like a guy with plus power at a position that like is probably filled for next year, but we don't know if it's filled beyond that. Man, that fits so good. And the fact that it started off so strong, and that for this brief sort of moment in time of this season, he was the topic in minor league baseball. He was, he was on MLB Pipeline's Twitter, like first and foremost. He was like getting talked about on Marquee. That to me was like the coolest thing that happened in the minors this year was that he made a name for himself that quickly, and that like he had that many exclamation points on what he was doing.
Yeah, I think the last 2 years in the draft, I've been trying since 2021 to go to the All-Star game, and not necessarily the game, but the festivities, and then I go to the Home Run Derby. And
Yeah.
one of the cool things, I would argue the timing is horrible for the front offices, but as a fan, it's cool to attend the draft. Like, that was awesome in Seattle. It was really cool in Texas last year. It just really made me feel like probably like NFL fans feel like on draft day, because I'm a huge baseball nerd, and like being there and like sometimes seeing these guys like put the hat on and like getting really excited about their potential. But the Cubs took 2 advanced bats in the last 2 years, and Matt Shaw in his kind of just meteoric rise at the end of last year, like that I did not think that was the standard, and to see Cam Smith come and do very similarly, like just like bounce right up like to advanced levels, like really just gave me some hope of, all right, there might be something in maybe the Cubs scouting system when they're looking at advanced bats in the first round that they've really tapped into, because this feels like a trend. Once is an accident, twice is a trend, and in the smallest way. So that was I agree. It's a great story, and it really adds some fuel to like my confidence in the development and the assessment of talent, because there were a lot of changes. I think that's not like the sexiest, the most publicized thing in the last year or so, and especially with Counsell coming in, I'm sure there's going to be additional philosophy changes and development changes this offseason as he gets to kind of construct his staff. And those are the types of things, those are the margins that I feel like are more important than, getting players on a team that might, like the 50-50 scenario of like everything gels, it's a great team. The margins should be like developing players and then taking one that's like a mid-tier player and turning them into a quasi-star, and then really just knowing like the top tier guys are getting at the top of the first round of the draft are like at least major league replacement players. Really tap into that Cardinal Devil magic for the first time in the Cubs' lives, instead of just having to stare off in the distance and wonder why some guy I've never heard of like becomes a major league average player at minimum down in St. Louis.
Right, and there's, if you talk about Matt Shaw and Cam Smith like being sort of representative of the step forward of the Cubs scouting department, like I love Matt Shaw. I can watch Matt Shaw hit every day and be happy doing it, but there is nothing exciting about what Matt Shaw does on it. Matt Shaw is not an exciting baseball player. He is a solid baseball player. He's a steady baseball player being it all. So if you want to show sort of a Joe Schmo Cubs fan, like, hey, this is representative of what the Cubs are doing, and you show them Matt Shaw, they'd be like that. But now you do that with Cam Smith. Cam Smith like looks like an Adonis in a baseball uniform, and he's hitting home runs in 6 games in a row. Like that's what your sort of regular score listener wants out of his minor league system is a guy that when he shows up in Chicago, you're like, oh, they're making him like that. And Cam checks that box, and so I think that's why it was so exciting for me is that Cam is somebody that we can all sort of rally behind, because like if he makes it, if he hits his top end projections, like that's what you want out of the minor leagues. That's what everybody wants. That's what us nerds want, and that's what your meatball down the street wants. So he checks them both for us.
It's one of those weird unity moments where the nerds and the meatballs hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Right.
So that leads us to the final question. Overall grade for the Cubs minor league system in 2024.
Okay, I'm gonna go B/B plus, and I'm gonna go B. I don't want your listeners to think that I'm just a homer who's just doing Jed's bidding for him. So I'm just gonna go a straight B.
You're not
think
doing something right on Cubs Twitter unless someone accuses you of like being Jed's minion.
Exactly, and I've been accused that more than most. So I need to combat it at all corners. But I think, I think if that grade, thinking through it more, like we're not talking about PCA and Bush, but we do have to acknowledge what Cade Horton did. So that's going to bring the grade down. But at the end of the day, the reason the grade stays high is the Cubs have at least 7 top 100 prospects. You could probably make arguments for 9. And the 6 top hitting prospects all moved their stock forward and did what they were supposed to do at the very least, if not took a big leap forward in a few cases like Ballesteros. And that's enough to have more than a passing grade to be happy with it. And, I think they have a system that's probably the I don't know, fourth through the eighth best system, somewhere in there. And that's what this organization should be striving for, I think, in the minors, and they have that. So like, I'm satisfied right now, but like with everything in this organization, like a little more, and that's what I'm asking for too.
All right, well, thank you so much. I want to give you some time to kind of plug your content on Northside Bound and any episodes you want to point out for, this is a podcast that's a pretty big fan of Cubs on Deck. We love the stuff that you guys do over there. This is our source for, following the minor leagues is your website, and I am a weekly listener of your podcast to kind of keep me informed of anything that I'm talking about on the minors. Here is usually sometimes regurgitated content from you guys. You guys are, to me, the top tier Cubs minor league site in the business.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, you can find me on Twitter at Cub Prospects, and my content, is it's pretty inconsistent these days. I largely sort of took the 2024 season off after a few years of Bleacher Nation, but the Northside Bound guys are friends and have been nice enough to invite me on the Cubs on Deck podcast as a regular, and to publish content when I'm there to make it. And so I think that will sort of continue to be the case this off season. We will definitely, we have some real fun guests lined up on Cubs on Deck, some Cubs minor league players that were real breakouts this season. So definitely be on the lookout for that, because there are going to be some fun conversations there.
Awesome. Well, Bryan, thank you so much. And this has been another episode of Bricks Behind the Ivy. If you have not, and you're watching this on YouTube, pound that subscribe button, share it with your friends. If you're listening to the audio, make sure that you are subscribing and reviewing the podcast, and also sharing with all these future brickheads. But until then, thank you so much, and go Cubs. Bricks Behind the Ivy is brought to you by Wrigleyville Sports, the best Cubs apparel store in Wrigleyville. Don't forget to use your code IVY10. Yes, that code is IVY10 for 10% off at discount. Also, check out Yagi Road Roasting Company. They make coffee for the special moments in life, so why shouldn't your coffee be just as special as you are? Yagi Road Roasting, link in the description for ordering. See you guys next week, and go Cubs.